memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory, the explanation of hippocampal amnesia changed completely and changed overnight. People said, well, the hippocampus is important for long-term memory, but it's not important for short-term memory. Then, a little bit later on, when people like Endel-Tolving began to make a distinction between encoding processes and retrieval processes, the theory of hippocampal amnesia shifted once more, and it was decided that the hippocampus was important for the encoding of new memories, but not for the retrieval of old memories. Then Craik and Lockhart tried to get rid of the short-term, long-term distinction by talking about shallow versus deep processing, and the theory shifted once more. Hippocampal patients couldn't do deep processing, but they could do shallow processing. Terry Winograd and John Anderson argued for a distinction between procedural and declarative memory, and then the theory was that the hippocampus got in the way of declarative memory but left procedural memory intact. Endel-Tolving makes a distinction between episodic and semantic memory, and the theory then becomes that the hippocampus gets in the way of episodic but not semantic memory. Dan Schachter makes a distinction between explicit and implicit memory, and we're told that the hippocampus impairs explicit memory but leaves implicit memory intact. And most recently, Howard Eichenbaum has argued for a distinction between relational and non-relational memory, that is, memories that are just isolated versus memories that are related to other kinds of things, and we're told that the hippocampus impairs relational memory but not non-relational memory. The fact about the hippocampus, that hippocampus causes anterograde amnesia, is all we know, okay? But explaining why it is that the hippocampus causes anterograde amnesia and how the hippocampus causes anterograde amnesia has tracked precisely developments in cognitive psychology. It's cognitive psychology that constrains the interpretation of brain function, not the other way around, okay? And that's true anywhere you look in cognitive neuroscience. The theory at the psychological level of analysis comes first, then we understand what then we can understand what parts of the brain perform that function. But, as I'll say a little bit later, in a different way, if you don't have the right description at the psychological level of analysis, you're never going to figure out how the brain does it, because you're going to be trying to figure out how the brain does something it doesn't do. First, you've got to have the right description at the psychological level of analysis, which leads me to this, for your wallet-sized cards. Psychology without neuroscience is still the science of mental life. We can do psychological theory perfectly fine without trying to figure out how the brain does it. How the brain does it is a really interesting question, but it's not necessary for psychological theory. At the same time, without a proper psychological theory, all you can do in neuroscience is figure out how neurons work. Okay? You can't figure out what neurons are doing, what their function is, unless you already have a proper description of mental life at the psychological level of analysis. Okay, end of diatribe. It still remains a legitimate function, a legitimate agenda for cognitive and social neuroscience to try to figure out how the brain performs some function that we've already specified well at the psychological level of analysis. This is, as you might expect, as you might know, a relatively new question for psychology. There was a time, not too long ago, when I was sitting in your seats as a college junior or senior, when we thought about the brain as a general-purpose information processor, that what the brain did was to form associations, and with a couple of exceptions, there weren't any kind of specialized areas of the brain. But cognitive neuroscience, beginning in the 1960s, especially after the 1970s, began to embrace what's known as the doctrine of functional specialization, the idea that there are discrete areas of the brain that are dedicated to specific psychological functions. We didn't have that at one point. We do have that now. And if you think about it for a second, it's only with the doctrine of functional specialization that it makes any sense to do brain imaging at all. Because what you do when you perform an fMRI study is you put somebody in a magnet, you have them perform some kind of task, and you look for what discrete areas of the brain light up when he or she performs that task. If you thought that the brain does it as a whole, you'd never do such an experiment, because all you can see is the brain light up, to which the only possible response is, well, duh, okay? It's only when the hippocampus lights up, or the fusiform area lights up, or the anterior cingulate gyrus lights up, when everything else stays quiet, that you can actually say, hey, look, maybe that piece of the brain performs this kind of function. Yes?
Well, that's involved, but couldn't you still say a link between neurons and behavior with that psychology?
I would say no. And the reason for that is, what behavior? Without psychology to tell you how to analyze the behavior that you're looking at. I mean, yeah, you can carve out the brain and see that the organism doesn't walk or something like that. But that's not what neuroscience wants to do. What neuroscience wants to do is to identify how the brain performs, how the brain implements various kinds of functions. But if you don't have the function described properly at the psychological level of analysis, you can't find out how the brain performs it, because you're literally looking in the wrong place. As with the hippocampus example, it's just not true that the hippocampus prevents new learning from occurring, as Scoville and Milner thought in 1955. It's not even true that the hippocampus lesions get in the way of long-term memory. But we didn't understand that until we understood at the psychological level of analysis that there's more to memory than short-term and long-term memory. Once we understood that, then we began to understand hippocampal function, but not until then. Yes. Yeah. Well, it's not true that neurologists have no training. In medical school, you get 6 weeks of behavioral science, typically. But a lot of them are psych majors, so they know something. Psych major, that's perfect pre-med major, you know. But what happens with neuroscience is that neurologists or neurophysiologists, they don't work alone on these things. This is now big team science. So we have psychologists who help design tasks. Think about the work on split brain, for example. Joe Bogan, he was a surgeon. He did the surgeries, okay? Roger Sperry was a neurophysiologist who was interested in how brain parts got hooked up. But it was Mike Gazzaniga, a psychologist, who designed those experiments. The three of them together. Gazzaniga didn't have the training to cut people's brains in half. Okay, Bogan didn't know that much then about how to design experiments. The three of them together worked, and that's how neuroscience works at its very best. But at that time, when they did those experiments, nobody was talking about the rhetoric of constraint. What they were trying to do is, gee, what does a corpus callosum do? Right? And then they found out all these wonderful things about hemispheric specialization, but only after Mike Gazzaniga designed these really brilliant tasks. Yeah. Anyway, so that was the brain in 1968. Parietal sensory motor cortex up here in the frontal and parietal lobes, a little bit of auditory cortex in the temporal lobe, a little bit of visual cortex in the occipital lobe, but the rest was just considered to be association areas. In 1983, Jerry Fodor, a philosopher, articulated the foundational doctrine for cognitive neuroscience known as the doctrine of modularity. And what Fodor argued was that there are certain cognitive processes that are associated, leave the rest of this out, associated with a fixed neural architecture. And what Fodor was especially persuaded by was work on language, where we know that Broca's area and Wernicke's area are important for language. And he argued that there are lots of other mental functions that have the same kind of quality, if only we could discover them, that we can now, that various mental functions are performed by specific mental modules that are themselves associated with specific modules in the brain. And it was this idea, really, that gave the impetus to cognitive neuroscience to begin to develop techniques like functional magnetic resonance imaging that would try to identify what this fixed neural architecture is. But again, notice that what the implications of the doctrine are. First, you got to know what the module does. That's a test for psychological research and psychological theory. Then you find out where its fixed neural architecture lies. Okay. And Fodor, there are lots of these examples now. We know that there's an area in occipital cortex that processes color. We know that there are speech areas in the brain, and that raises the idea that there might actually be social cognitive modules as well. And lately, psychologists, philosophers, other cognitive scientists have begun to think about what these social modules might look like. Of course, this itself is a project that goes way back in the history of psychology to phrenology. Okay, and you'll remember that the phrenologists had this idea that there were various faculties of mind, intellectual faculties, cognitive faculties, and emotional faculties that were located in particular locations in the brain, and they had the idea that by examining lumps and dents in people's skulls, that they could figure out where they had a lot of brain tissue or where they didn't have too much, and relate those aspects of physiology, is what they had in mind, to these various kinds of faculties. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about this, there's a classic phrenological head. Cautiousness was supposed to be here, in what we would now call the posterior parietal lobe, and imitation up here, and benevolence and veneration down here, emotiveness here, emotiveness, the capacity for love, destructiveness here around the ears, and so on. That was what the phrenologists thought. They got it pretty much all wrong, of course. But what's really interesting about phrenological theory in the context of this class is how many of the phrenologists' mental faculties, fully 20 of the 35, are social in nature. Okay? And here in blue, we've outlined the areas that have explicitly social content with them, and you can see that it's a vast bulk of the brain, especially the posterior portion of the brain, in phrenological theory, had to do with social cognition. Social cognitive neuropsychology really has its roots in this, the phrenologist's attempt to look at mental faculties, by which we would now think of them as mostly social faculties and brain structures. Okay. So how does this all begin? Well, again, as you know, probably in the middle part of the 19th century, two neurologists, Broca and Wernicke, identified two separate portions of the brain that seem to be important for language and speech functions. Broca's area here in the temporal lobe, damage to that produces motor aphasia. Patients can understand speech, but they can't speak very fluently. And Wernicke identified this area in the temporal parietal area, now known as Wernicke's area, that produces receptive aphasias, where the patients can't understand speech very well. The search for modules really begins here, and it's this kind of evidence that inspired Fodor to write his doctrine of modularity. But even before then, we had the case of Phineas Gage. Okay, 1848, Phineas Gage had his wonderful accident. He was a railroad worker who was building a new line using a tamping iron to put gunpowder, blasting powder, into rock. He made a mistake. He set off a charge, which sent the tamping iron running right through his head from his left cheek, behind his left eye, and exiting from the top of his head right at the top, in fact, of his head. And the amazing thing about this, the first amazing thing, was that he actually survived this. He was taken home and survived, and after about 12 weeks, seemed to have recovered completely. And he made it into the medical annals just for that. Afterwards, however, his physician, especially John Martin Harlow, a famous physician, began to notice changes in Gage's personality. Oh, by the way, just for references, those of you who are really interested in Phineas Gage, this is the definitive book on Gage. It's a wonderful book by an Australian psychologist, Malcolm Macmillan, called An Odd Kind of Fame. Recently, in Smithsonian Magazine, we uncovered an actual photograph of Gage. This was a line drawing based on people's impressions of his injury. This is what Gage actually looked like, and he's posed here with the tamping iron that went through his head. You can see the scar in his cheek, blind in one eye, and he's got a comb over here. At one point, Gage used to let people part his hair so they could see the hole in his head. Anyway, if you want to know everything there is to know about Gage, read this book. It's a terrific book. It's MIT Press. There's the original account of the accident. This is Gage's skull, which you can see in the Count Way Memorial Library at Harvard Medical School. This is a death mask. You can see that the wound had healed over here, but this is what the skull looked like. There's the injury in the left cheek, and there's the exit. What Harlow noticed was that after the accident, Gage became changed in personality. Okay, in his final assessment, written 20 years later, basically said, in this regard, his mind was radically changed, so decidedly that his friends and acquaintances said he was no longer Gage. Gage was no longer Gage. So that before the accident, Gage was very efficient. He was capable. He was energetic. He was persistent. He was well liked by his friends and neighbors. But after the accident, he became now more impulsive, fitful, impatient, obstinate. Didn't defer to his elders. Didn't defer to his superiors. This is all we know about Gage. Most of what you read in textbooks about Gage is grossly exaggerated. Okay, this is one of the points of Malcolm Macmillan's book, is to trace what people have said about Gage and try to connect it to the documentary record. Yes, Gage's personality changed, but it's not the case that he became this kind of ne'er-do-well who couldn't keep a job or anything like that. In fact, he emigrated from New Hampshire to California around the gold rush time, worked in San Francisco for many years, and when he died in 1860, he was buried here. If you go to Colma, to the Pioneer Monument at the cemetery in Colma, his bones are interred there. So yes, there were changes in Gage's personality that Harlow attributed to the damage to his brain. But most of what you read in textbooks are statements about age that are really not in the documentary record. They are exaggerations of what's going on. But what's interesting about it is, look where the exit wound was for the tamping iron. In areas, the phrenological areas, 13 and 14, as Harlow put it, in the area of benevolence and veneration, precisely those two qualities that Gage seemed to lose after his accident. This was all 1848 and 1860. This is before Broca, before Wernicke. If Harlow had been able to present Gage's brain, Phineas Gage might have become the index case for neuropsychology and cognitive neuroscience. But because Harlow didn't have access to his brain, he only had access to his skull, that didn't happen. What we're going to do next time, following in this tradition, is to look at recent contemporary evidence about the functional localization of various social and personality faculties. But we're going to go back to the point I tried to make today, which is that the neuroscience, when it comes to cognitive and social neuroscience, the neuroscience is only as good as the psychology. And as we'll see, you've got to get the description of the psychological function right before you can understand what it is that the brain is doing. Thank you. See you on Wednesday.